Hi. So we're very happy to have Barbara Petrongolo here from Oxford University. So I will take the chance to ask you 2 or 3 questions about your most recent research. So in your latest research, you have an historical overview of how the study of gender in the labor market has evolved since 1980. I was going to ask you, what would you say is the most significant shift in academic thinking during this time?
So the literature on gender has advanced enormously in the past few decades, and in a sense it has paralleled the development of gender inequalities and gender convergence in the labor market. One of the most important development in this literature was a sort of clearer acknowledgement of what is the role of gender differences in preferences, characteristics, traits, and the role for understanding gender inequalities. And on the other side, what is the role of differential access, differential opportunities, differential constraints in the entry of women and men in the labor market at large and in specific occupations. So under one hypothesis, if men and women tend to be different in some relevant traits, then the inequalities that we observe in the labor market are just a reflection of those differences. In the other case, one may think that, well, perhaps men and women on average are fairly similar, but they may face different constraints. Now, of course, this distinction is very important, but at the same time, it's a bit of a simplification because it's not so clear-cut. In a sense, one may think that some gender differences, for example, in traits, attitudes, or behavior, may be a consequence of pre-labor market entry discrimination. So, of course, the divide is not that easy. But anyway, let's work with that divide. So the recent literature has shown that in many respects that seem to be relevant for the labor market, men and women are a lot more similar to one another on average than previously thought. And the analysis has been focused a lot more on gender differences in constraints. And this is important for understanding the causes of gender inequalities, because whenever different groups face different constraints in the entry to labor market opportunities, then we really have to think about allocative efficiency. So gender inequalities are not just a manifestation possibly of like social injustice, which would be important per se, but also the fact that perhaps we might not be using females' talent in the best possible way, but also men's talent in the best possible way.
Brilliant, thanks. And you highlight in your latest work the role of societal norms and gendered constraints. So can you tell us an example of how these norms shape labor market outcomes for women today? Perhaps, something that might have surprised you during your research.
Right. So if one focuses on differential gender constraints, the big driver here is, of course, the differential involvement of men and women in looking after children. So basically, it's more or less all about children, or almost everything about children. And the reason why fertility has these disparate impacts on the labor market earnings of men and women cannot be really explained by gender comparative advantages, for example, because this kind of unequal impact of fertility also happens in couples in which the woman was the breadwinner before having children. So there is plenty of evidence showing that perhaps is really some sort of gender norm about the appropriate roles in societies, in families, in workplaces, appropriate roles for men and women that induces a certain gender specialization within households and therefore differential involvement in the labor market. Something that is kind of surprising, perhaps I would say 2 things. One thing is that these kind of gender norms remain fairly persistent even after decades of advancement, for example, of women in human capital investment, the labor market, leadership role. Nevertheless, some norms remain fairly persistent. But at the same time, something that perhaps it's even more surprising is that the society at large tends to overestimate the degree to which people tend to be conservative. So suppose that there is a certain proportion of people in the population that believe that is detrimental for children's development, that their mothers work in the labor market. Suppose there is a certain proportion that is conservative in this respect. Then the second order belief is a lot more conservative. So we tend to think that people around us are more conservative than they actually are. And this is important because if we tend to behave not just according to our own intrinsic beliefs, but also we might have behavior that responds to peer pressure, what our peer group is going to think about us, then we might end up behaving more conservatively than what our own preferences would sort of tell us to do, precisely for social pressure. So this is really an issue of misperception of social norms. So in this case, one could achieve a more equal allocation by simply redressing this kind of misperceptions. One doesn't really need to change anything intrinsic about people's beliefs or religions or attitudes. It's really a matter of like sharing the correct information about what are societal norms.
So you've been mentioning the role of perceptions and what people think the others might think, right? And so if you could see one major question about gender and labor market, answer it in the next few years, what would that be? What do you think is, an area where we really need to advance in order to understand what's going on?
Yeah, so it seems that the literature has reached some kind of consensus about the role of norms, stereotypes, and their misperceptions to some extent. So it would really be very important to identify those stereotypes where they exist, and they may originate in families, in the education system, in the media, in research, and in the workplace. So identify those stereotypes and then start to redress them. But probably the most important thing is really coming to an acknowledgement of where the stereotypes are, what is their extent, in which sort of milieu the stereotypes remain sort of persistent, and then trying to redress them. Sometimes we think about the sort of consequences of those stereotypes for the workplaces, so the different performance of men and women in the workplace, but a lot of that starts a lot earlier with families and education.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Barbara, for this
Thank you very much.
Great chat. It was great having you here.
Thank you.